Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. The dead and those about to die. It's a different look at D-Day from a slightly different perspective than we might be used to, and it's by John C. McManus, who is our guest.
We are about to observe the 70th anniversary of what many call the most important day of World War II and perhaps of all the 20th century. Winston Churchill called it the cause for the biggest celebration in the history of the world. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst and commentator Al Spry. It's great to be here with you, Reagan, as always.
Always a pleasure, sir. And we do want to acknowledge our friends on TV 30, Tough TV 38 as well.
Tough TV 38, where you can watch Reagan and I do our thing 3 times a week, Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays at 9 a.m., all across Orlando, and we are also on the Tough TV network occasionally. That is a nationwide network, so we're glad to be associated with Tough TV. And if you can't get Tough TV in your area, well, go call Bright House or DirecTV or Dish Network and say, I want my Tough TV, TUFF TV, get it, because otherwise it's no fun. TV's no fun
there you go.
Without Tough TV.
All right.
I'm passionate
that
about
works.
Tough TV.
That works.
So it's interesting. I came across this article, and it was all about if Charlie Crist had run for governor as a Republican in 2010 instead of eyeing up the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
His decision in 2009, rumor has it, his wife wanted to go to Washington. That's what I had heard.
It was strong that his wife absolutely hated Tallahassee. Yeah.
And but I guess he talked her into coming and liking Tallahassee again.
Well,
but anyway, that's what I hear on the street, being a political guy. Yeah. So he decides to not seek a re-election, which is the first governor in Florida history not to seek re-election since the 2-term limit was created in 1968. So people wonder what would have happened. Number one, him not seeking it opened the door for Rick who. Remember everyone was saying, Rick who?
Yeah.
Rick Scott, who spent a ton of money and became our governor.
Yep.
It allowed Jeff Atwater and Pam Bondi to win statewide office. It changed career paths for Bill McCollum, basically making him retire. Yep. And Alex Sink, who pretty much is going to retire because she can't win anything, trickling down to affect other Republicans. He renounced his Republican ties in 2010, ran as an independent, lost to Marco Rubio, and now he's trying to reclaim his former job as a Democrat. That makes him the first to mount a credible candidacy for governor as both a Republican and a Democrat, Reagan.
Yeah, of course, the track record for Charlie Crist goes back a little bit farther than that. As far as we know, and the record speaks, the only office that he ever ran for re-election to was his Florida legislative seat from the St. Petersburg area in the days when he was known as Chain Gang Charlie.
Right. Because
he advocated bringing back chain gangs to clean up the highway system in Florida. And education commissioner, attorney general, governor, he never ran for a second term as anything, and nobody ever got a chance to speak as a referendum on what he had done. So it's interesting.
Well, and in a poll by Quinnipiac University in April 2010, a few weeks before Crist left the Republican Party, 49% of voters approved of his job performance as governor, which is better numbers than Governor Rick Scott has received in any poll by the same organization. Also consider that Scott wouldn't have taken the risk of challenging an incumbent governor of his party. McCollum would probably still be state attorney general. Sink would probably still be chief financial officer. And so it just changed the whole landscape, really.
Yeah, I think the Democratic candidate in that year still could have been former Congressman Jim Davis, but I do think that Charlie Crist, in all probability, would have won, despite the economic downturn and whatnot, would have won re-election to a second term as governor. He saw that open Senate seat and said, let's go for it.
Well, you got to take a chance, but now he's going to try to come back as a Democrat against a Republican who has a lot of support and a lot of money. So we'll see how that one plays out. But it's just an interesting story, one of those only in Florida stories, Reagan, that we like to talk about here on Florida Roundtable.
I think that's the absolute truth, Al. Only in Florida. That's FLORIDUH.
One thing makes great about this show versus doing a show like Wyoming Roundtable is that things actually happen here. Really strange and kooky, wonderful things that we get to talk about and parse and stuff, which we really couldn't do if we were doing Wyoming Roundtable. Nothing against Wyoming, by the way.
All right. Well, we're going to pause along the network line. When we come back, we'll be talking with historian John McManus. The 70th anniversary of D-Day is approaching. He's the author of a new book, The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll be joined by John McManus as the conversation continues.
Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies.
The message of liberation came in many tongues. The French of Charles de Gaulle.
La bataille suprême est engagée. Après tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, voici venu le choc décisif.
The Polish foreign minister in exile.
Żołnierze, lotnicy, marynarze Polacy. Wkraczamy w decydującą fazę generalnej rozgrywki I porachunku z Niemcami.
Those who were there say King Haakon wept as he spoke to Norway.
Landsmenn, som det i den store strategiske plan, som har taget sigte på frigjøring av Europas undertrykte folk.
There were messages from the Dutch, the Danes, and the Belgians.
Mes chers compatriotes, les opérations préliminaires pour la libération de l'Europe ont commencé.
I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Together we shall achieve victory.
And that's the way it was on June the 6th of 1944, Al. Imagine you had lived in Europe in 1944 when the German war machine rolled over everything. Adolf Hitler was in charge. You didn't know where your life was going. And comes this marvelous message from General Eisenhower and some of the other voices you just heard. It sent chills down my spine. Freedom, this is it. We're going to be free. The monster is going to be put aside. Well,
yeah, exactly. It was quite a moment. We have a wonderful guest to talk about his new book on an aspect of D-Day, and his name is John C. McManus. John, welcome to Florida Roundtable.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The book, of course, The Dead and Those About to Die, from Caliber Books, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach. And, John, before we get into all of that, you have a degree in American and military history from the University of Tennessee. How about go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and why it was you decided this book was necessary?
Right, yeah. I got my doctorate at Tennessee. I went there because Tennessee had a very special program going called the World War II Veterans Project, in which we were gathering firsthand material from World War II veterans, of course, interviewing people, but also gathering letters, memoirs, diaries, maps, photographs, firsthand stuff, and worked under a great professor named Dr. Charles Johnson. Did my dissertation there, and then since I've moved on to an academic career. I'm a full professor of U.S. military history at Missouri University of Science and Technology, and of course my area of emphasis tends to be World War II through the present and kind of military history through the eyes of the average soldier. So over the years, I had really studied Omaha Beach rather intently, and I had studied it first as a young tourist. I studied it when I was in graduate school at Tennessee in a program called the Normandy Scholars Program, in which we got to spend about a month on the ground in Normandy, which was tremendous. Later on as a battlefield historian and then as an author. And what amazed me is that as of 2 or 3 years ago, there was still more to know about Omaha Beach that I don't think was quite as well known or understood, and specifically, that's the story of the 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach on D-Day.
And that division was known as the Big Red One. Tell us about the Big Red One. Of course, that's part of the title of the book, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach.
I think one of the things that appeals to all of us as we study history or just current events is personality, just a distinctive and unique personality. And the Big Red One as a division had exactly that. It had derived its nickname from its service in World War I. And, of course, obviously the nickname comes from the fact that this is the 1st Infantry Division, and they have a patch with a sort of a blood red 1 against a green or olive drab background. And they'd done a lot of fighting in World War I, but in World War II, they had done even more fighting in North Africa and Sicily. They'd carried out a couple of amphibious invasions. The unit had a reputation, in high command as a go-to outfit, one that gained ground, one that achieved objectives, a fighting kind of unit. And that was the good news. The bad news was it had a reputation when it was off the line of being, sort of undisciplined, tempestuous, rebellious, troublemaking, getting into fights and drinking and carousing and all that. This is wont to happen, especially for combat soldiers. So but by the spring of 1944, the 1st Division was certainly too valuable not to use in the coming invasion. But in the view of the higher-ups, it needed to be recalibrated with new leadership, and that's where General Clarence Hubner comes aboard in the late summer of 43.
I was going to say, it sounds like the NFL or something, with the players.
Right. I mean,
you get all that testosterone going, right? And then it's hard to turn that stuff off, I would think.
And it's part of that, and I think part of it is just the natural, and especially in World War II you see this, the natural kind of tension you're going to have between combat soldiers who do most of the fighting and dying, and those in the rear areas. And this is a very American thing. We believe strongly in logistics and a lot of materiel, and of course that absorbs a lot of personnel. And so the Big Red One, these guys, when they come off the line, they kind of resent these guys who have a safer deal and who sleep in beds and get first access to bars and women and all of that. And so that's going to lead to trouble. And there was a sense that the commander at the time, General Terry Allen, and his second in command, General Ted Roosevelt, son of the president, were of course first-rate combat leaders and very good men, but they weren't always big on the I's and O's of discipline kind of thing. And so both of them were too valuable just to send home permanently, but they are eased out of leadership roles in favor of Hubner. And Hubner is sort of the best of both worlds as well, in that he's a tremendous combat leader, but he's a little more strack on discipline as well.
Gee, for a moment, June the 6th, 1944, the planning had gone on for months and months and months. And I have heard the argument made that June 6th was the most important day of World War II, perhaps of all the 20th century. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an argument that I think is prevalent in the West and among Americans, because that is, when we look back as Americans, in a figurative sense at least, that's when the United States really takes the first major step to become a superpower, an internationalist military and economic superpower, because this invasion cannot happen unless the United States is in a position to lead it. And it doesn't mean it's not a multinational effort and that the alliance isn't important. I wouldn't say that for a second. But it is a harbinger that the United States is going to carry the load, not necessarily just really on D-Day, but the campaign that's going to follow for the next 11 months when most of the hard fighting is really done. And, of course, as we know, a lot is at stake in Normandy on June 6, 1944. Now, of course, remember, though, the Soviets were fighting the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front. So to them, the Normandy invasion is just one more rough day among many, and they would see it as they took the leading role in defeating Germany. And it's an argument that continues to rage onward to this day. But I don't think there's any question that when you look at the span of the 20th century, or really all of modern history, It's very difficult to find a day of such significance as June 6, 1944.
Well, and I think some people don't realize that Eisenhower had also written a speech saying that the invasion had failed. The invasion was by any means guaranteed, especially with they had to deal with weather conditions that were unfavorable, and then trying to scale these large walls, rock walls, and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is, in the view of many of the planners from Eisenhower on down, I wouldn't call it a gamble, but certainly, a major risk. And sometimes I take issue with some of my colleagues, historical colleagues who study the invasion of World War II as a whole, and kind of smugly saying, well, they were going to get ashore, they were going to win. It wasn't, I don't know that it was really that that cut and dried. A lot of things could have gone wrong, and I think. When you think about all that is required to make this happen the right way, it is just an enormous human story. And what tends to draw me to it is the really hard fighting that had to be done and the soldiers who did it. There's nothing guaranteed about your victory at Omaha Beach at 8 in the morning on D-Day. You would never see it that way as a soldier. It's a life and death proposition with very high stakes.
You said a lot of things could have gone wrong. Actually, a lot of things did go wrong. Many of the soldiers were landed at places where they weren't supposed to be. The currents and the tides were different. They didn't plan for the hedgerows. They had the wrong kind of clothing. Lots of things. How much actual training when the Big Red One got to England beforehand? Take a minute and talk about the kind of training that these guys had to go through.
These guys were intensely trained in the fall months of 1943 and the spring months of 1944 to prepare for this invasion. You had a really fascinating mix of people. And I go into some detail on this in the book. The grizzled old and really rather cynical and jaded and sort of feeling sorry for themselves veterans from the Mediterranean, and then the new guys who have replenished the ranks and are trying to live up to the esprit de corps of the 1st Division. And they are training so heavily, so hard on weapons proficiency, physical fitness, hiking, but especially, of course, amphibious assaults, that there's hardly time to rest at times. They're training so much on mock landings that some of these guys swear they're in the Navy rather than the Army.
John, tell you what, we hold that thought. We'll come back to it, but we do need to take a pause along our network line here. Let us remind you that you are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest, military historian John C. McManus, his new book, The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach, as we mark the 70th anniversary of the most important day of the 20th century. We'll continue in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area, we are seen on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is military historian John McManus. He is the author of The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach. And John, as we went into that last break, you were talking about the training, and I mean, we're talking about months and months of training that went on in England before this invasion actually happened, and I want you to be able to go ahead and finish up that thought.
Right, and General Hubner, Clarence Hubner, had a real passion for preparing soldiers for combat. He had actually seen a lot of combat himself in World War I, and actually with the Big Red One. He had joined the Army as a private, ends up as a master sergeant, then he gets a commission. He completes World War I as a lieutenant colonel with the Distinguished Service Cross. So he understood a lot about what would work in combat and what would not, and how you pay the price if you're not prepared properly. And so weapons proficiency is really important to him. He wants to make sure his guys can deal with and shoot a lot of weapons that aren't necessarily ones they're carrying. He wants to make sure that people can do the jobs of others, and a person 2 or 3 latches higher in the chain of command, say, because casualties happen. Hubner makes sure that the unit is at least prepared in that sense for what's about to come. And as I've often said, Certainly there's a lot of flaws in the plan, and Omaha Beach itself is sort of a, Exhibit A for Murphy's Law, as far as everything going wrong. But in the end, Huebner has trained these guys to at least a winning standard, and I think that's one of the reasons why things turn out the way they do at Omaha Beach for the Big Red One.
So you ascribe a lot to Huebner. What made you choose the Big Red One as the division for this book?
Yeah, what made me choose that is that I felt, I wouldn't say the Big Red One was overlooked at Omaha Beach, but it was not as well understood or known as it could be. And I felt that this was a way to see a really famous battle, which I would argue is right up there with, say, Gettysburg in terms of our national heritage and some level of mythology, but also certainly tremendous importance. I felt that in looking at the Big Red One, that we could look at Omaha Beach almost with new eyes. And the reason I say that, you saw a tone set from the beginning in World War II among the historians of that time to look much more at the western part of Omaha Beach, at the fight of the 29th Division and the Rangers. They did about 600-plus pages of study on them, and they did about 80 on the Big Red One. And so subsequent history has tended to follow that same path, culminating, I think, with the tremendous movie Saving Private Ryan, but I felt that if we saw the First Division and we looked at that D-Day as they saw it, and we brought these individuals to life again, we could see perhaps a different aspect of Omaha Beach than we previously had.
One of the most difficult things, I would think, as you put this together, and I guess the first part of the question is, how long did it take you to get this book assembled? And we are losing that World War II generation at an astounding rate. The veterans are leaving us at 1,400 a day, maybe even more than that now. There were 16 million of them when the war started, by the time the war was over. But talk about the research process versus some of the fellows that you were still able to interview in person.
Right. And in some ways, I've been working on this book for over 2 decades. This is the third book I've done on D-Day/Normandy kind of subjects. I did a dual series 10 years ago, a book called The Americans at D-Day, another one called The Americans at Normandy. And what struck me in looking back on that is how little I had really covered in depth what I should have at Omaha Beach. And so over the years, I had gathered material, of correspondence with veterans, or I had talked to people, I had interviewed some folks, I had gathered material other historians had, and as far as the research when I did this specific book, it was about a 2 to 2.5 year process, just in a tangible sense of doing the archival research and then writing the book. But I like to think that I've been working on it, as I said, for a couple of decades. But, you're right. I mean, the veterans are unfortunately going fast. And so there really aren't many left who were, part of the heavy fighting on D-Day morning. It's a small group. And one of the many gifts they've bequeathed us, besides our freedom, is their history. They've done a really good job of telling their story, of writing it in memoirs, or making the letters available, doing oral histories, doing interviews with people. So that, in combination with the original records, which are vast and rich and excellent, I think allowed me to bring this to life like hardly anything else possibly could, and that's really exciting for me as an historian. So I like to think that maybe a reader can be immersed in what D-Day was like for just this group, this division, and this part of Omaha Beach.
Let's do a little synopsis. You describe the D-Day from the perception of the Big Red One as 19 hours of hell. Let's kind of go through it from their eyes, a brief kind of synopsis in your mind there.
Right, and the worst of that hell, I would say, is that first 3 to 4 hours. H hour on D-Day morning at Omaha Beach is 6:30, and the reason they chose that is more or less that was going to be low tide that morning. They wanted low tide so that they could see the obstacles and any mines, so that they could, disarm the mines and blow gaps in the obstacles. Well, pretty quickly that goes out the window because of the ferocity of the opposition. And you're looking at about 400, 500 yards of open beach, and pretty flat beach and rocky beach to cross. So that only adds to the carnage. I would say that first 2 to 3 hours are just nightmarish. Most people are laying it off course. The timetable is blown. You have people who are weighed down with way too much stuff, which I believe is a pattern in American military history of what we do with our soldiers. You're talking about 70, 80 pounds of stuff. You're wet. You're seasick. The uniforms you're wearing are gas impregnated, in case the Germans use poison gas, and they're itchy and they're uncomfortable. They don't breathe and they stink like sour milk. People are seasick. They're frightened. Their weapons are fouled with sand and sea spray, and so it's just really kind of a fight to the death initially. And what really begins to turn this around is when small groups start to find ways off the beach. If you're on the beach as an American at Omaha Beach, you're a target. If you're inland, you're probably a hunter. And so when you're able to get a little bit inland and start flanking around some of the German defenses, deal with them face-to-face almost, this is bad news for the Germans. They're going to be overwhelmed eventually with this.
One of the things that and I wanted to mention, the principle of self-responsibility. The American private corporal sergeant had to take responsibility. They didn't necessarily wait for the colonels or the generals. The generals were back on the boats, and part of the problem for the Germans on D-Day was that when they called Berlin, they had the Führer principle. They had to look up to Adolf to get the big orders. And on June 5th, 1944, Adolf Hitler had gone to bed in a very foul mood. And basically his staff was afraid of him. And they didn't want to, he'd wake up in a foul mood and blah, blah, have you shot. And so they were afraid, when the calls came that the invasion had started, they were afraid to wake him up. And they couldn't get the orders to send in their reinforcements. So, we made a lot of mistakes, but thank God the Germans made a lot more.
The Germans definitely made more, and especially Hitler. In some ways, he was the best friend the Allies had in the terms of the mistakes he made. His pattern was that he was a night owl, and so he was asleep much of D-Day morning, and they didn't want to wake him. You're right, but you had this even before that. You had this dysfunctional command structure for the Germans in which Hitler was going to control a lot of their key mobile reserves. That might have made a difference on D-Day. We'll never know, obviously. I tend to think the armored reserves for Omaha Beach would never really have been in play because of just the way the terrain is there. It's very difficult with the hedgerows and, of course, and just the ridge line and the kind of rocky crevices and all that are not conducive to armor and vehicles. But for the Americans, this is a soldiers and a junior leaders fight with only a very few exceptions, and that's part of what's striking about Omaha Beach. It's the sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains, and I go through what I think are some of the key personalities, guys like Tech Sergeant Phil Stresik, Staff Sergeant Raymond Strozny, Lieutenant Jimmy Monte, Captain Joe Dawson. All these people I hope kind of come to life. You can see how the decisions they made and the actions they took really made a difference at Omaha Beach throughout the day.
And I think one of if I may make a comment on this, when you read this book, The Dead and Those About to Die, what comes to mind to a great extent is some of the writings of the great Ernie Pyle, who led the life of the soldiers that he wrote about and died in a foxhole. This is first-person history, so well written, and I have to give you 5 stars for that. I also have to say we've got to pause again along the network line here to take another break and allow the stations to ring the cash register, if you will. Let us remind folks that you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
We are talking with John C. McManus, author of The Dead and Those Who Are About to Die, and we'll continue in a moment. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area, we're also seen on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, military historian John McManus, the author of The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach, from Caliber Publishing. And John, before we get to our closing thoughts, your choice of title has an interesting story behind it. And before we have to go, I wanted to tell the story of how you picked that title.
It does, and I really think it sort of encapsulates what Omaha Beach is all about. The title comes from a phrase which is, I would point out, wrongly attributed in the movie The Longest Day to General Norman Dutch Coda, the guy played by Robert Mitchum. Well, he was in the 29th Division, and they have him saying, there's only two kinds of people going to be on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Well, actually, Colonel George Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry, which was the lead assault unit for the Big Red One at Omaha Beach, he's the one who said that. And I found out, this is what's really interesting, I think, I found out that this was not spontaneous, that he had been thinking about this many months ahead of time. In September of 43, he wrote this kind of wide-ranging memo about infantry leadership, and he knew a lot about amphibious assaults. And he writes at that time that basic phrase. And so when he comes ashore about 2 hours after H hour, he's near obsessed with this notion. And so he stalks up and down the beach telling people this and motivating them to do something. And a lot of times that's all it takes in combat is just someone to tell you what to do. And so Taylor's role is really quite crucial in getting people off the beach and thus saving lives, but also, I think even more crucially, in doing that, he reinforces some of the original groups that had gotten off the beach and could have been quite vulnerable otherwise. So Taylor ends up getting awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on D-Day and promoted to Brigadier General, and I felt that there was no more appropriate way to kind of summarize the battle and perhaps honor him than to come up with that as the title.
I think many of us have seen that movie, The Longest Day. I was just thinking about it when you were speaking earlier. How close is that to the actual way that D-Day played out? How much did it add to the mythology of it? And wanted to get your input on the movie versus your book here.
Well, I think if we look at The Longest Day as a book, it's phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And Cornelius Ryan, the research he did, especially for the 1950s, so soon after, and then they preserved it as a wonderful collection of material for historians like me, I think it was amazing. Once something gets translated into film, sometimes then myths take hold. And I know Ryan himself was very frustrated with some of the things that ended up in the movie. But overall, I would say, The Longest Day is certainly a classic film for a reason. And it does express what was at stake in D-Day. It does show a lot of the personal stories. And overall, I find that all these years later, it's hard for me to stop watching whenever I see it. So, yeah. But as an historian, I can never, resist parsing at the inaccuracies.
And I also like to take the first 30 minutes or so of Saving Private Ryan as one of the most accurate recreations of this great battle. Before we have to go, John, the meaning. What should Americans, as we observe this 70th anniversary, what thought should we have, and what should they take away from your book?
There are seminal moments in the history of our country, and I don't think there's any question that June 6, 1944 is one of them. As I've mentioned before, it is the kind of beginning of a new America in a figurative sense, and it's an America we can relate to because it's the one we're part of, a kind of a massive internationalist superpower. It's one of the things you see on D-Day. It's the beginning, in a larger sense, of some massive American sacrifice in terms of lives lost for places overseas. If they had failed at Omaha Beach, it's possible we would live in a different world today. And I do think that there's a larger purpose and meaning to understanding why it all played out the way it did. And I hope in this book, what I've really tried to do is to kind of bring to life a lot of these people who were part of it as real flesh and blood people. This is all so long ago, 70 years, that it can seem very distant, especially for those who were killed at the time. And in kind of digging around for the personal story in tandem with what I could construct as the most accurate sort of rendering events based on the records, I hope that I've been able to kind of, again, humanize and personalize who these guys were, and that maybe you can relate to them a little bit.
John, I think you have done that so very well. And, the question often asked, where did we find such young men? And I think that General George Marshall had the answer. He said these were the best damn kids who were the product of the freest society that the world had ever known. And Adolf Hitler bet that the German youth, brought up in the Nazi youth, could beat an American Boy Scout. And he lost that bet. Well, John, our hat's off to you on the 70th anniversary of D-Day. John McManus, author of The Dead and Those About to Die. It's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach. And, John, we hope you will come back and visit with us again when the next one is ready.
I would love to. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we do say again thank you to John McManus. And Al and I will have a closing thought following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. And in the Orlando area, we're also seen on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on this show. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you taking your time out of your day to listen to us babble on, Reagan.
Well, I want to make one quick note before we get to our last couple of stories here, but relevant to the World War II generation and whatnot.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's true anymore, but a couple of years back, the state of Florida had more retired veterans than any other state. Now, the World War II generation, I think that perhaps California and Texas have inched ahead of us a little bit, but we have more of those people left than just about anywhere else in the country, and I hope that a good number of them got to hear.
I hope so. A lot of folks from the generation are passing away. You see it in the obituaries every day, but we appreciate your service if you are listening to us today.
Yeah.
So the winner and loser of this week in Florida politics, the winner is John Thrasher. He's Tallahassee's ultimate insider. He looks like a lock to become the next president of his alma mater, Florida State University. And he doesn't even have to compete for the job. Boy, wouldn't you love a job where you didn't have to compete for it?
Yeah, really.
Loser of the week. This is a real loser. This is Charles Van Zandt. He's a Republican state representative from Keystone Heights. He gave a speech that went viral last week on YouTube, I imagine, and other places, where he warned that the folks implementing Florida's Common Core educational standards, we've had someone on pro and against Common Core, and they brought up some interesting points, both of them. They were rational people, unlike Mr. Van Zandt. Mr. Van Zandt, he's saying that the educational standards are aiming to, quote, attract every one of your children to become as homosexual as they possibly can, unquote. A product
even the people we had on who were against this didn't say that.
A product of Florida schools, Van Zandt now looks like a poster child for the need to improve the state's educational standards, is the quote here.
I would say
which,
that's,
well, look, here's the thing. I know a few gay Republicans, and I often say it's hard to be a gay Republican. The reason why is, you back the Republican stance on freedom and less government and less taxes, which a lot of us do, including us, Reagan.
Yep.
But then it's hard to get around the anti-gay hatred that spews from representatives of the Republican Party. It just seems like they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't be open-minded enough. Some could, like you said, Ronald Reagan opened the Big Tent. But now it just seems to be a party of reaction against, gays and women and minorities, and especially the aliens, the immigration, illegal aliens that are coming over. I really think that the Republican Party has to come to terms with itself if it wants to attract more people.
And they better do it fairly quickly because November is coming up faster than we care to think about it. Well, it is time for us to run up the white flag and call this one a show. We do want to say thank you for your time this week. Send us a note, send us an email. We still get snail mail here at the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we do appreciate your time. We certainly do. We know you got lots of choices out there. And we'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email Reagan Smith at fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.